Today, the year is 2025, and the world watches with growing concern as the conflict between Ukraine and Russia continues. Many European nations have cut off political and economic ties with Russia. Among them are the Baltic states, Georgia, and Moldova. Yet, not too long ago, these countries, along with Ukraine, Armenia, and several others, were all part of one large nation known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR. This was a global superpower, covering 1/7 of the world's landmass and made up of 15 republics with Russia at its core. It was the nation that defeated fascism in World War II and was the first to conquer outer space. It had one of the best educational systems in the world and a formidable military force. In the late 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev served as the head of the Soviet Union, a man who would later win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990 for his role in de-escalating global tensions. Western media praised him, calling him a pivotal figure at the end of the 20th century. Time magazine even named him one of the 100 most influential people of the century. But while Gorbachev was receiving awards, living standards in the USSR were 2 to 3 times lower than in developed Western countries. By the early 1990s, many former republics had declared independence. The government began rapidly losing control over both the nation and its economy. So what happened? Why did a global superpower collapse so suddenly in 1991 after nearly 70 years of existence, burying with it the dream of a bright communist future? Why did so many republics suddenly push for sovereignty? Who was to blame? Was it Mikhail Gorbachev, the USSR's first and last president? Was it a string of unfortunate events, or the inevitable result of deep-rooted political and economic mismanagement? Or were the evil capitalists really behind it? Let's try to unpack this. As with any serious issue, we need to go back to the roots, to the very beginning. Let's rewind to the early 20th century, when the Russian Empire collapsed, and after revolution and civil war, the communists seized power. It's important to note that Russia was historically an agrarian country. Most of its population were peasants living in rural areas and working the land. The working class, what Marxists called the proletariat, was only just beginning to emerge. At the same time, the world was on edge. World War I had ended with the Treaty of Versailles, but many politicians warned that it was just a pause before the next storm. French Marshal Ferdinand Foch even said, "This is not peace. It is an armistice for 20 years." In this tense global climate, the USSR emerged as a new state, initially uniting just 4 republics: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian Federation, which included Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. The country was led by Vladimir Lenin, a revolutionary who founded the first socialist state in history. The young Soviet government knew it couldn't afford to fight another war. The country didn't yet have a strong army or enough weapons. It needed to boost the economy and improve living standards, which meant rapidly expanding its industrial base. This challenge was taken on by Joseph Stalin, who rose to power after Lenin's death. Stalin famously said that if the USSR didn't catch up to the West, falling behind by 50 or even 100 years, it would be crushed. And it had to make that leap in just 10 years. Not an easy task. To build factories and industrial centers, you needed educated people, but over half the population couldn't read or write. Many peasants had never even attended school. So the government launched a massive literacy campaign. Adults and teenagers were educated for free across the country. It became one of the largest educational reforms in Russian history. But literacy wasn't just about operating a machine on a factory floor. It was also about enabling citizens to engage with political and social life. After a long day's work, a person could come home, open a newspaper, and know what was happening in the country, who was being recognized for their labor, what plans were being discussed. It created a sense of unity and purpose. By the late 1930s, the literacy rate had reached 80%, and full literacy was achieved shortly after World War II. That educated population became the foundation for implementing ambitious reforms, such as the Golro Plan, Russia's first national electrification project, which kick-started Soviet industrialization. After the revolution and civil war, Soviet Russia was in ruins. The economy had collapsed, factories had stopped, and large parts of the country had no electricity. The Soviet leadership understood that without rapid industrialization, the new socialist state would not survive. Russia lagged far behind the West in industrial development. There weren't enough factories, urban enterprises still ran on coal and firewood, and rural areas were still using candles. Electrification was the key to overcoming that backwardness. Now power lines stretched out to towns and villages, bringing light and comfort to homes. The first electric trains began running on Soviet railways, but most importantly, cheap electricity powered factories, workshops, and large-scale agricultural projects. In the 1920s and 1930s, foundational industries were built, many of which still underpin Russia's economy today. To keep these industrial giants running, a reliable source of energy was needed, so the USSR began building power plants. In 1925, the Shatura power station became the first Soviet thermal plant running on peat. Next, they turned to hydropower. To fall from the heights and turn defeat into power that drives machines and pushes trains forward, wrote poet Samuel Marshak in his poem War with the Dnieper. Soon after, two major hydroelectric plants, Volkhov and Dnieper, began transforming the Soviet economy. The Dnieper plant became the largest hydroelectric station in Europe at the time, supplying power to southern Ukraine and southwestern Russia. The Golro Plan was fully completed by 1935 and marked a massive success. By the late 1930s, the USSR's electricity output had increased sevenfold compared to 1913. The Soviet Union had become an industrialized nation. Its energy infrastructure fueled the development of machine building, metallurgy, transportation, and agriculture. Cities gained street lighting, electric transit, and radio communication. The country had achieved technological independence from Western fuel and technology. Everything was on track. But then came the next challenge. As life improved in the cities, people began leaving villages en masse. Wages were better, living standards higher, and before long, nearly 8% of the entire population had become industrial workers, leaving behind agricultural life. The population was growing, but who would feed them if fewer people worked in agriculture? And here the Soviet leadership made its first serious and later catastrophic mistake: collectivization. One of the most controversial and large-scale campaigns in Soviet history, collectivization began in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Its goal was to replace small individual farms with collective ones. Though it transformed agriculture, it also had devastating social and economic consequences. Let's look at why. To keep factories running and cities fed, agriculture had to be strong. But the reality: peasants still farmed their land by hand. Their plots were small, under-equipped, and inefficient. Meanwhile, Soviet factories had started producing tractors and harvesters, essential tools to feed a growing population. But individual farmers couldn't afford such expensive equipment, nor did they need it for tiny plots of land. Plus, the land was fragmented. Strips of one person's field were mixed with others, separated by gaps up to 5 meters wide. A land reform was long overdue. Europe had done it 2 centuries earlier. The USSR was seriously lagging behind, so the government decided to merge small farms into collective farms, kolkhozes, and set up machine tractor stations, MTS, which would rent out modern equipment to them. This could have rapidly modernized agriculture, but there was one big problem. Peasants didn't want to join collective farms. In kolkhozes, they no longer worked for themselves. They worked for the state. Land, tools, and livestock became communal property. The government didn't take no for an answer. Conditions for peasants became unbearable, pressuring them to join collective farms. In theory, the idea of consolidated farming with machinery wasn't so bad, but in practice, it turned into a disaster. The process of collectivization was brutal, and its consequences were devastating. Millions of lives were disrupted. For poorer peasants, joining a kolkhoz was a way out of poverty, but wealthier, more successful farmers, called kulaks, refused. These people had built productive farms, had strong harvests, and had no interest in handing everything over to the state. They were labeled enemies of the people. The state stripped kulaks of everything they owned: livestock, equipment, even their homes. Many were arrested, exiled, or even executed. Their farms were seized, and they were branded as class enemies. This forced collectivization shattered centuries-old village traditions and destroyed private initiative. People lost the motivation to work well. Why bother when effort brought no personal reward? Even worse, the most skilled and entrepreneurial farmers were eliminated. This had long-term effects on the agricultural economy. Harsh policies, bad planning, forced food requisitions, and production breakdowns led to the Great Famine of the 1930s, which hit Ukraine, the Volga region, Kazakhstan, and the Kuban especially hard. Millions starved. People began to lose faith in the government, and that distrust would resurface later. By 1940, collectivization was mostly complete. The Soviet government had achieved its goals. Peasants had been brought into collective farms, food supplies reached the cities, and industrialization had accelerated. But the price? Millions of lives lost, destroyed rural communities, and a weakened agricultural sector. Still, there were some positives. Villages gained schools, clinics, and community centers. People no longer had to travel miles to see a doctor, and they could relax after work with movies or dances at the local club. The cities and military were fed thanks to kolkhozes, which aimed to meet government production quotas and earn bonuses. During the industrialization era, the USSR ramped up grain exports, which helped finance massive construction projects. Thousands of large factories were built. By the end of the 1930s, Soviet industrial output was 9 times higher than it had been at the start of the century. The Soviet economy became the second largest in the world, behind only the United States. And that industrial base would prove crucial in the Soviet Union's victory during World War II. But now the war is over and peace has returned. It's time to slow down the pace of heavy industrial growth and shift focus to producing furniture, clothing, and other consumer goods that improve people's quality of life. Only now, a powerful new political rival appears from across the ocean: the United States. A global arms race begins. The USSR keeps producing machines, tools, and equipment, while the light industry, the one responsible for everyday goods, begins to collapse. Then come financial troubles. The country is drained by the war. There's not enough money to build up military strength or invest in advanced new weapons. To make up for it, the government starts buying grain and food from collective farms at extremely low, fixed prices. Here's where we need to talk about the planned economy of the USSR. Is planning in itself a bad thing? Of course not, as long as it's done wisely, balancing the interests of everyone involved. Imagine you're the best potter in your town. You make beautiful clayware, jugs, bowls, everything. But to make good pottery, you need good clay. So you strike a deal with a neighbor who brings you clay, and together you agree on fair pricing. Higher quality clay costs more, lower quality costs less. You also study the market. What do customers want right now? Big grape harvest this year? Make wine jugs, big cooking competition in a nearby town. Time to make stew pots. You manage both the quality and quantity of your production carefully. And of course, you set your own prices. You know when to raise or lower them based on the market. That is smart, responsive economic planning. In the USSR, however, all enterprises were state-owned, and economic decisions were made by officials in the State Planning Committee, Gosplan. But these officials weren't good at strategic thinking or creating efficient plans. In reality, what they called a plan often worked more like a command. Gosplan decided which goods factories should produce and how much. Gosnab, State Supply Committee, assigned raw materials, who got what from whom. Goskomsen, Price Committee, set fixed prices for both inter-enterprise trade and retail sales. Remember these roles. We'll come back to them and see what they led to. So, what was happening with agriculture? How did central planning work there? They'd look at previous year's production and make up new goals for the next year or 5-year period, along with fixed prices. But these plans were unrealistic and poorly balanced, making them almost impossible to achieve. Farm workers earned next to nothing. But no one wants to work for free. Many peasants lived in poverty, and the young and able began leaving the countryside. The country was rebuilding after the war. Cities needed workers, and urban jobs paid better. Millions left the farms for factories. By the early 1960s, almost half the Soviet population lived in cities, and that number kept growing. Agriculture was in decline. And remember, before the war, nearly 70% of the population had lived in rural areas. Now let's look at Soviet exports. How was the USSR doing in the global market? Not great. The Soviet Union sold 10 times less machinery and equipment to capitalist countries than it bought from them. So, what happened to all the unsold Soviet equipment? There was only one option: send it to developing countries as economic aid. But of course, there's no profit in that. At the same time, Soviet goods weren't in high demand. Heavy industry was functioning, but consumer goods were in short supply. How did this happen? Where was the miscalculation? The answer is clear. Central planning left no room for private initiative. This was the second major mistake of the Soviet government. Let's revisit how planning worked. Gosplan made the plans, Gosnab distributed the raw materials, and the Price Committee fixed prices. Sounds organized, right? But no one accounted for consumer demand, raw material quality, or factory capabilities. There was a plan, and it had to be fulfilled no matter what. That became every factory's mission, and instead of making useful, high-quality products that people actually needed, they produced whatever was easiest and fastest to manufacture, often very low quality. To meet targets, they cut corners on product quality, on efficient use of materials and energy, on worker safety, and even on environmental standards. Smaller businesses were pushed out, while large factories flooded the market with low-grade, identical products, because that was cheaper and met the quotas. Nobody wanted to modernize these massive plants or repurpose them for new products. After all, so many resources had already been spent building them. Why start over? But perhaps most damaging was this: the Soviet leadership feared innovation and change. Whenever skilled engineers and inventors tried to improve production or introduce new ideas, they ran into a wall of bureaucracy. What if their invention disrupted the system? What if it meant rethinking the plan? Better to avoid risk and keep the system as is. And what was the result? Well, what happens when you never open the hood of your car, never take it in for a checkup, and just hope it keeps running? The answer is obvious. At the worst possible moment, it just won't start, and you'll have to find another car. That's exactly what happened with the Soviet economy. It simply stalled, and the USSR became heavily dependent on foreign suppliers for goods and technology. But that takes money, and a lot of it. So where would they get it? Let's rewind to the early days of industrialization. Back then, the Soviet Union was still an agricultural country and exported large amounts of grain. The income from those exports helped fund the purchase of vital industrial equipment. But now, with agriculture in shambles, the USSR could no longer sell grain. It didn't even have enough for itself. From being one of the world's top grain exporters, the country became a major grain importer. The Soviet Union had fallen into a pit it dug itself. To revive and modernize agriculture, which by then barely had any workers left, the country needed to purchase new industrial technology. The idea was that a renewed agricultural sector would boost food production and help stabilize the economy. But again, to buy something, you need money, and to get money, you have to sell something. A classic vicious cycle. The USSR had nothing to sell, and no one wanted to dip into the gold reserves. So what if they developed untouched land? Nikita Khrushchev, the new Soviet leader, looked at the map of the vast country, so much unused land, in Kazakhstan and Siberia. Thus began the Virgin Lands campaign. The government hoped these new farmland areas would yield bountiful grain harvests. The land was fertile, but as usual, they forgot to account for the climate. And the climate out there was harsh and unpredictable. Strong, constant winds blew away the freshly plowed topsoil. Dust storms swallowed up entire villages. It soon became clear that the Virgin Lands campaign was another failure, and the program was quickly shut down. Still trying to revive agriculture, the Central Committee of the Communist Party made a long overdue move. They raised the state purchase prices for grain and meat from collective farms. But that just made things worse. Inflation took off. To try and contain rising prices, the government rolled out a monetary reform in 1960-1961. Officially, it was a simple currency redenomination meant to drop a few zeros from banknotes. But it turned out to be yet another economic blunder by Khrushchev, and the consequences came quickly. First, a lot of products vanished from store shelves and ended up at markets instead. While store prices were slashed by 90% in line with the new currency, prices at open-air markets only dropped by 50%, sometimes even less. Cynical store managers started funneling high-demand goods to collective farm markets, where they could fetch higher prices. This created a growing divide between people. Some could afford to live comfortably, while others were barely scraping by. Then came another hit. Incomes were already falling, and in May 1962, the government announced a 30% hike in retail prices for meat and meat products, and a 25% increase for butter. Public unrest followed. Protests broke out in different regions. The most well-known uprising happened in the South. Workers at the Novocherkassk electric locomotive plant walked off the job and took to the streets with signs, meat, milk, and higher wages. They blocked the rail lines, halting trains. Word of the strike quickly spread across Novocherkassk, and workers from other factories joined in. By midday, around 5,000 people were protesting. The military was sent in to break up the protest and arrest the organizers. 7 were executed, and many more were sent to labor camps for anti-Soviet propaganda and banditry. The government feared that force alone wouldn't be enough to keep the peace, so it rushed cheap food into the city. But they knew what happened in Novocherkassk could easily happen anywhere. They had no choice. The USSR urgently bought massive quantities of food from abroad, spending a third of its gold reserves. So by the early 1970s, a country that was once a powerful agricultural exporter now relied heavily on imported food. A looming sense of inevitable collapse was in the air. Do you believe in dumb luck, or what people call a fortunate twist of fate? Like when your shoes suddenly rip and a neighbor calls out of the blue saying she bought a pair for her daughter that didn't fit, and she's offering them to you at a great price. It happens, right? Something like that happened in the USSR, a bit of luck that helped delay the looming crisis. In the late 1960s, geologists discovered massive oil and gas reserves in western Siberia. A new field was developed. Then came the Arab-Israeli War, and in protest, the Middle East cut oil exports. This triggered an energy crisis. Global fuel prices skyrocketed. The Soviet Union seized the moment. It ramped up oil and gas production several times over and became one of the world's top fuel exporters. Billions of dollars poured into the state treasury. The Soviet leadership breathed a sigh of relief, and decided not to bother reviving agriculture or modernizing industry. After all, Siberia had endless oil and gas. Why not just pump it out, ship it overseas, and enjoy the profits? The money would easily cover all imports, and there'd even be enough left over to support poor countries building socialism. The incompetent government didn't even try to modernize its own manufacturing. It was easier to import mass-produced consumer goods, cheap, boring, low-quality stuff that flooded Soviet homes. By the end of the 1980s, the Soviet Union was importing vast amounts of not only machinery and equipment, but also a significant portion of its food products from abroad. Meanwhile, Soviet oil and gas were flowing to Europe. Massive investments were being made into the development of the oil refining industry. New cities were emerging, and new wells were being drilled. It seemed like the crisis had passed, and the country could continue living in relative peace. However, in the mid-1980s, the United States made a deal with the Arab sheikhs, and global oil prices plummeted drastically. Moreover, natural resources were not infinite. Oil production began to sharply decline, and the cash flow slowly dried up. This meant only one thing: the Soviet Union would no longer be able to import as much food and new technologies from capitalist countries as it had before. If only there had been competent economists and politicians in power, those who were truly interested in the country's development and strengthening, perhaps this deadlock could have been avoided. But mistakes followed one after another, which only worsened the country's economic situation, bringing it closer to total collapse. The USSR continued to assist countries in the socialist camp. These weren't only nearby countries, but also newly established states that had adopted socialism, such as Cuba and African nations. Supporting them required huge amounts of money. Moreover, help was not only requested by countries from the socialist bloc. In an attempt to assist Afghanistan, the Soviet Union sent its troops into the country in 1979. The Soviet-Afghan War began, lasting nearly 10 years. It would cost the lives of thousands of young Soviet soldiers and 30 billion rubles from the country's coffers. As we've already seen, many of the reforms in the USSR were poorly thought out. But notice that every leader appointed to the position of head of state carried out similar poorly planned reforms. Mikhail Gorbachev was no exception. In 1985, he launched a campaign against alcoholism, declaring a dry law. The idea was, as always, well-intentioned and humane. But it was economically disastrous. It dealt a severe blow to the country's economy, especially since the already weak budget would lose nearly 10% of its income from alcohol sales. The economy of the country began to collapse like a cardboard box in a heavy rainstorm. The shortage of financial resources became more acute each year. These were tens of billions of rubles. What's the usual response in such cases? Exactly. They start printing money. And what does that lead to? You guessed it. Inflation skyrocketed, and there was a massive shortage of goods. Everyday essentials like sugar, flour, soap, and salt disappeared from the shelves. People bought everything they could in huge quantities. They had to get rid of their money, which was losing value by the hour. By the early 1990s, less than 11% of consumer goods were left on store shelves. The acute shortage of goods caused widespread discontent, and mass protests and rallies began across the country. People no longer believed in the government with its planned economy, nor in the bright future of communism. At this time, glasnost and democracy, which Gorbachev had introduced in an attempt to reform the country, began spreading throughout the regions. But they had the opposite effect. Glasnost led to open discussions about the crimes of Soviet authorities, repression, hunger, and corruption. People began to see just how deeply the crisis had penetrated the system, and their trust in the Communist Party vanished. With democratization, alternative political movements began to emerge. The power of the Communist Party weakened significantly, and this eventually gave the republics the chance to demand autonomy. In 1986, Gorbachev made another attempt to save the country by passing a cooperative law which allowed for individual entrepreneurship. But once again, things only got worse. The planned economy descended into even greater chaos, and the shift toward a market economy was uncontrollable. Enterprising cooperators started buying goods from state-owned enterprises at government prices and selling them at market prices. This resulted in legalized speculation. The USSR had no banking control system, so cooperatives freely converted money at the new banks that popped up like mushrooms after the rain. Now, let's debunk the myth that the collapse of the USSR was the fault of capitalists, and the United States in particular. In fact, the Western countries were just as shocked by the collapse of the Soviet Union. Not long ago, international political analysts commented on the economic situation in the Soviet Union, noting that, despite the slow pace of economic growth, the future could bring sudden changes. An economic collapse wasn't even forecasted. Yet by 1991, the country's budget was already 58 billion rubles short, which meant pensions and salaries for the military and the Navy could not be paid. An economic crisis had begun. The Soviet Union was a multi-ethnic country made up of 15 republics and numerous ethnic groups. During the crisis, the republics began their fight for independence. Realizing that no one could stop them now, the leaders of the former Soviet republics supported the formation of nationalist movements. Ethnic conflicts that had been suppressed by the Soviet government for years broke out. The fight over borders began. The weakening of central authority and the economy allowed local leaders to raise the issue of the sovereignty of their regions. Estonia was the first to express its desire to leave the USSR, followed by Latvia, Lithuania, Georgia, Armenia, and others. This marked the beginning of a parade of sovereignties among the autonomous republics. To keep them in a unified state, the central government no longer had the authority or finances. There was no longer a unified state with a cohesive economy, ideology, and territorial integrity. The only thing left was to prevent a civil war in the former Soviet republics, some of which possessed nuclear weapons. That's why the collapse of the USSR happened relatively peacefully. On December 8, 1991, the presidents of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed an agreement in Minsk regarding their withdrawal from the USSR and the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev announced his resignation, and on December 26, the Soviet Union, USSR, officially ceased to exist. For some, a great power was lost. For others, it was their homeland. The collapse of the USSR was caused by a combination of economic issues, political instability, the rise of nationalism, and the weakness of central authority. Attempts at reform only accelerated this process. As a result, in 1991, a great power that had existed for 69 years disappeared from the political map of the world. There is still debate about the causes of the collapse of the USSR, but one thing is clear: it was the inevitable consequence of the accumulated crises and mistakes